He married her for money, but she had already changed the will. Before we begin, answer this in the comments. How long do you think a person can pretend to love someone before greed reveals the truth? On the morning of Margaret Ellison's funeral, her husband wore the wrong face. Richard Vale stood beneath the gray stone arch of St. Matthew's Church in a black suit that had been tailored 2 days before Margaret died. His hand rested over his heart whenever someone important approached. His eyes lowered at exactly the right moments. His voice broke when he thanked the mayor for coming. To anyone watching from a distance, he looked like a devoted widower fighting to remain standing. But those who had known Margaret for more than a year noticed what was missing. There was no confusion in Richard's eyes, no shock, no helplessness, no grief that forgot its manners and arrived without permission. He never once turned toward the church doors as though expecting Margaret to walk through them and correct the terrible mistake everyone had made. He kept checking his watch. At 11:23, while Margaret's daughter Claire stood beside the casket receiving condolences, Richard leaned toward his attorney and whispered, "How long does this usually take?" The attorney, a nervous young man named Peter Sloane, glanced at the polished walnut casket and lowered his voice. "The service. The estate process." Peter's face tightened. "Not here." Richard straightened and returned his mournful expression, just as a photographer from the local newspaper raised her camera. Across the aisle, Naomi Patel saw everything. Naomi had been Margaret's attorney for 26 years. She had helped Margaret purchase her first commercial property after the death of her father. She had reviewed every major contract signed by Ellison Textiles. She had drafted trusts for Margaret's daughter, negotiated the sale of a failing mill, and once spent Christmas Eve in a hospital waiting room because Margaret refused to sign an emergency document without someone she trusted beside her. Naomi was not surprised by Richard's question. She was only surprised he had waited until after the service began. Margaret had predicted nearly every move he would make. The church filled with the people Margaret had collected throughout a life built on equal parts discipline and kindness. Factory supervisors sat beside city officials. Women who had received scholarships from the Ellison Foundation sat behind men who had once worked night shifts at her first warehouse. Retired employees came in wheelchairs. Younger employees stood along the walls when the pews ran out. Richard looked at them and saw witnesses to his importance. Claire looked at them and saw pieces of her mother's life. She was 42, with Margaret's steady brown eyes and her late father's habit of pressing her lips together when emotion threatened to escape. Claire and Margaret had not always been close. For almost 8 months before Margaret's marriage to Richard, they had barely spoken without arguing. Richard had been skilled at turning concern into insult and caution into jealousy. Every warning Claire gave her mother had become evidence, in Richard's hands, that Claire cared more about the estate than Margaret's happiness. Now Claire stood alone beside the casket, carrying the guilt of every conversation she wished she could repeat. The minister spoke about Margaret's generosity, her courage, and the unusual way she remembered the names of employees' children. He did not speak about the final year of her life. He did not know about the locked medicine cabinet, the changed household staff, or the quiet terror that had settled behind her eyes. Richard dabbed his cheek with a folded handkerchief. There were no tears on it. After the burial, Naomi asked the immediate family to meet at her office at 4 o'clock. Richard's head lifted. Today. That was Margaret's instruction. Surely everyone needs time. She was specific. Claire looked at Naomi, searching for meaning. Naomi gave nothing away. At 3:55, Richard arrived at Patel and Moore with Peter Sloane beside him, and a confidence he no longer tried to hide. Claire was already seated in the conference room. So was Margaret's younger sister, Ruth, who had flown in from Arizona. Beside Ruth sat Evelyn Carter, Margaret's housekeeper and companion of 18 years. Evelyn's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her dark blue dress still carrying a trace of cemetery dust along the hem. Richard paused when he saw her. "Why is staff here?" Evelyn looked down. Naomi closed the door, because Margaret requested her presence. Richard sat at the head of the table. Naomi waited. After a moment, Richard frowned. "Is there a problem?" "That was Margaret's chair," Naomi said. A small silence passed through the room. Richard smiled as if he had been corrected about a harmless detail. Of course. He moved one seat to the right. Naomi placed a thick cream-colored folder in front of her but did not open it. Instead, she turned on the large screen mounted on the wall. Richard's smile disappeared. What is this? A message from Margaret. Claire inhaled sharply. The screen flickered and Margaret appeared. She was sitting in the sunroom of her home, wearing a pale green blouse and the pearl earrings Claire had given her on her 60th birthday. She looked thinner than she had at the funeral home, but stronger than she had during her final weeks. Her back was straight. Her hands rested calmly on the arms of the chair. For one impossible second, Claire felt that her mother was alive again. Margaret looked directly into the camera. "If you are watching this," she began, "then I am gone. Claire, my darling, I am sorry for every day I allowed distance to stand between us. Ruth, thank you for being the only person who could make me laugh when I was determined to be angry. Evelyn, you gave me loyalty when loyalty became the most expensive thing in my home." Then Margaret's expression changed. "And Richard," she said, "if you are sitting close to the head of the table, please move. You always did mistake proximity for ownership." Ruth covered her mouth. Claire stared at the screen. Richard's face drained of color. Margaret continued, "You married me because you believed my loneliness had made me foolish. You believed age had made me grateful for attention and blind to ambition. You believed that once you placed a ring on my hand, everything I built would eventually fall into yours." Richard pushed back from the table. "This is absurd." Naomi raised one hand. "The recording is part of the estate instructions. Please remain seated." On the screen, Margaret leaned slightly forward. "You were wrong about one thing, Richard. I did not discover your plan at the end of our marriage." Her eyes were clear and merciless. "I discovered it 3 days before our wedding." No one in the room moved. Richard looked from the screen to Naomi, then to Claire. Peter Sloane's pen stopped above his legal pad. Margaret's recorded voice filled the room. "And on the morning I became your wife, before the flowers had wilted, and before you woke from the champagne you drank with another woman, I had already changed my will." 11 months earlier, Margaret Ellison had stood in the second-floor hallway of her own home and listened to the man she planned to marry explain how long he expected her to live. The house was alive with wedding preparations. Florists carried white roses through the kitchen. A string quartet rehearsed beneath the cedar trees. Rental trucks moved up and down the circular drive. Margaret had escaped upstairs because everyone kept asking her questions about ribbons, seating cards, and candles. She was searching for 5 quiet minutes. Instead, she found the truth. The guest room door was almost closed. Richard's voice slipped through the narrow opening. "Don't start this again." A woman answered, low and angry. "You said 6 months." Margaret stopped. She recognized the woman's voice. Kendra Shaw had been hired 8 weeks earlier to coordinate the wedding. She was 34, beautiful in a sharp, deliberate way, and always seemed to know where Richard was even when Margaret did not. Richard sighed. "I said 6 months after the marriage, not 6 months from the day we met." "And then what?" "Then we stop hiding." "You still haven't told me how." "Her heart condition is worse than she admits." Margaret's fingers went cold around the railing. Kendra lowered her voice. "That doesn't mean she'll die." "No, but the stress of the company, the medication, the travel, things happen. If they don't, we encourage her to retire. Once I have power of attorney, I control the board votes and the accounts." "And the daughter?" "Claire is almost gone already. Another argument or two and Margaret will cut her off completely." Kendra was silent for a moment. "And the will?" Richard laughed softly. Margaret would remember that laugh for the rest of her life. "The current version leaves almost everything to the surviving spouse. She told me herself. She thinks that proves trust." "You asked her." "I didn't have to. Lonely people volunteer information when they want you to believe you are loved." Margaret stepped back before the floorboard beneath her could creak. Her first instinct was not rage. It was shame. She had spent 40 years believing she could read contracts, markets, competitors, and men. She had built Ellison Textiles from one half-empty warehouse into a company with 600 employees. She had survived a recession, a fire, a lawsuit, and the death of her husband Thomas. She had trained herself never to sign what she had not read and never to trust what had not been tested. Yet she had allowed Richard to make her feel chosen. Now, on the eve of her wedding, she realized she had not been chosen at all. She had been calculated. Margaret moved quietly into her bedroom and locked the door. The mirror above the fireplace reflected a woman in an ivory robe with silver beginning to show at her temples. At 63, she did not look fragile, but Richard had seen something fragile in her anyway. Not her health, her loneliness. For several minutes she stood without moving. Then she walked to her desk, took out her phone, and called Naomi Patel. Naomi answered on the second ring. Please tell me you are not calling about the prenuptial agreement the day before the wedding. I need you to come to the house. Margaret. Tonight, after midnight if necessary. What happened? Margaret looked toward the wall, separating her room from the hallway. I finally read the contract. Naomi arrived at 10:45 carrying a leather briefcase and wearing running shoes beneath a charcoal suit. Margaret let her in through the library door. The wedding rehearsal dinner was still happening across the lawn, where music and laughter floated between the trees. Richard believed Margaret had gone upstairs with a migraine. In the library, Margaret repeated every word she had heard. Naomi did not interrupt. When Margaret finished, Naomi asked, "Do you want to cancel the wedding?" Margaret looked through the glass doors at Richard. He stood beneath the lights with one hand on Kendra's back as they spoke to a group of guests. When he noticed Margaret watching from the dark library, he removed his hand. I should. That is not an answer. No, Margaret said quietly. It is what a sensible woman would do. And what do you want to do? Margaret thought of Claire. She thought of the board. She thought of the old will Richard believed would make him powerful. She thought of the humiliation he had planned for her and the confidence in his laugh. Then she looked at Naomi. I want to know how far he is willing to go. Naomi's expression hardened. That is dangerous. So is handing a thief a map and pretending he is a guest. You do not need to prove anything, walk away. If I cancel tomorrow, he will say I panicked. He will find another woman, another lonely house, another family to divide. Kendra will disappear, and Claire may never believe how completely he manipulated us. You are talking about marrying a man you know is using you. I am talking about letting him believe his plan is working, while I protect everything he came to steal. Naomi crossed her arms. What exactly are you proposing? Margaret turned from the window. Change the will tonight. Naomi studied her for a long moment. To what? Place the company shares into an irrevocable trust. Claire receives voting control after my death, but only after an independent review confirms she was not involved in any coercion. Set aside funds for the employee's pension plan. Increase the foundation endowment. Leave the house to Evelyn for life, then to the foundation. And Richard. Margaret's voice did not tremble. $1. Naomi almost smiled but did not. A symbolic gift can invite a challenge. Then give him something conditional. What condition? If we remain married for 10 years, and if no court or investigation finds that he exploited, coerced, defrauded, neglected, or harmed me, he receives the lake cottage and a $2 million trust. If any condition fails, he receives nothing. Naomi opened her briefcase. Margaret, once we begin, there is no pretending you did not hear what you heard. Margaret looked across the lawn again. Richard was smiling beneath the lights, charming her friends, accepting congratulations for a future he believed he owned. I am done pretending, she said. From now on, he is the one who will be pretending. That night, while the wedding flowers opened in silver buckets, and the man she planned to marry slept peacefully in the east guest room, Margaret Ellison signed a new will at 1:17 in the morning. Naomi and two witnesses watched her initial every page. Before she put down the pen, Margaret added one final instruction. If I die unexpectedly, she said, do not tell Richard what he inherits until you know exactly how I died. Naomi closed the folder. Outside, the first rain began to fall. By noon the next day, the sky had cleared, the guests had arrived, and Margaret walked down the aisle toward a man who believed she was giving him everything. She smiled when he took her hand. Richard mistook that smile for love. It was the first mistake he made as her husband. The first 3 weeks of the marriage were almost beautiful. Richard was attentive in the way only a patient actor could be. He brought Margaret coffee before she asked for it. He learned the names of her doctors. He placed a hand at the small of her back when they entered crowded rooms. At dinner, he asked about Ellison Textiles and listened as if the details of freight contracts and labor negotiations fascinated him. He also began collecting information. At first, the questions were harmless. Which bank held the family trust? Who had access to the private office? Did Claire own voting shares? What happened to the company if Margaret became ill? Which medications caused drowsiness? Had Thomas left any sealed instructions before his death? Margaret answered carefully, mixing truth with enough uncertainty to keep Richard curious. She told him the old will remain valid. She never mentioned the new one. Every morning, she recorded notes in a small leather journal Naomi kept in a secure office safe. Every evening, she sent Naomi a brief message confirming she was safe. They established a phrase Margaret could use if Richard was nearby and she needed help. The roses need trimming. It sounded domestic and forgettable. Naomi promised that if Margaret ever said those words, she would contact Claire and the police. Margaret also hired a private investigator named Louis Ortega. Louis had spent 22 years as a detective before opening a discreet office above a pharmacy downtown. He wore inexpensive suits, spoke slowly, and never tried to impress anyone. Naomi recommended him because he had once uncovered financial exploitation in a retirement community without frightening the victims or alerting the suspects. They met in the back room of a quiet restaurant. "I need to know who Richard Vale was before he met me," Margaret said. Louis opened a notebook. "How far back?" "As far as the truth goes." The truth went back much farther than Richard had expected anyone to look. His legal name was Richard Vale, but he had used Richard Vance and Rick Valen in different states. He had been engaged twice and married once. His former wife, Helen, had inherited a successful dental practice from her father. Within 2 years of marrying Richard, she had sold the practice, refinanced her home, and transferred nearly $700,000 into joint investments that later disappeared. The marriage ended after Helen accused Richard of forging her signature. No criminal charges were filed. She was ashamed, Louis explained. She settled quietly. He signed a confidentiality agreement and left the state. Where is she now? Living in Oregon, remarried. She agreed to speak with me, but only if her identity stays protected. Margaret stared at the photograph Louis placed on the table. Richard was younger in it, but the smile was the same. What did he tell her? That she was brilliant, underappreciated, too generous with people who did not deserve her. He encouraged arguments with her sister and business partner. By the time he started moving money, she had almost no one left close enough to challenge him. Margaret looked out the restaurant window. That sounds familiar. There is more. Richard has significant gambling debts. Private card games, online accounts, 2 loans connected to men who are not known for patience. He owes at least $400,000, possibly more. And Kendra. Louis turned a page. Kendra Shaw is not only the wedding coordinator. She and Richard have shared an apartment lease in the past. She also received regular transfers from one of his accounts for nearly 3 years. Margaret felt the familiar ache of humiliation, but it no longer weakened her. Each fact was becoming a brick in a wall around the fortune Richard wanted. Does he know you are looking? No. Keep it that way. At home, Richard became more affectionate as his questions became sharper. One night, he poured Margaret a glass of wine and sat beside her in the library. You work too hard, he said. I have worked this way for 40 years. That does not make it healthy. It made the company possible. He smiled. I am not criticizing you, I worry. Margaret turned a page in the report she was reading. That is kind. I spoke with Dr. Bennett. Her eyes lifted. About what? Your heart. My medical care is private. I am your husband. For 23 days. The smile remained, but warmth left his eyes. I thought marriage meant partnership. It does not mean ownership. Richard leaned back. Why are you defensive? I am not. You are, and lately you have been forgetful. Margaret closed the report. In what way? You asked Evelyn twice what time dinner was. No, you told me dinner was at 7, then asked Evelyn to serve it at 8. He paused. It was the smallest pause, but Margaret saw it. Richard took her hand. This is exactly what I mean. You have been under enormous stress. I think you should consider stepping away from daily operations. Do you? Temporarily. And who would handle my responsibilities? The board, Claire, me where appropriate. Where would it be appropriate? He rubbed his thumb over her knuckles. You do not have to interrogate every expression of concern. Margaret gently removed her hand. Concern that becomes impatient when questioned is usually ambition. Richard stood. For a moment, his face became unfamiliar. The charm fell away so quickly that Margaret saw the man who had laughed behind the guest room door. Then he recovered. You are tired, he said. I am observant. He left the room without finishing his wine. The following week, Richard invited Claire to dinner. Margaret knew it was not a peace offering. Richard had spent months persuading each woman that the other was suspicious and controlling. Now he wanted them in the same room because conflict would help him. Claire arrived carrying a bottle of wine Margaret had loved for years. She paused in the entryway, as if she were no longer certain she belonged in the house where she had grown up. Evelyn hugged her. Margaret almost did the same, but Richard appeared behind her and placed his hands on her shoulders. Look who finally made time for us, he said. Claire's expression tightened. Dinner began politely. Richard told an amusing story about getting lost on the way to a charity event. Margaret asked about Claire's architectural firm. Evelyn served roast chicken and disappeared into the kitchen. Then Richard brought up the company. I have been telling Margaret she deserves a rest, he said. Claire looked at her mother. Are you feeling worse? I am feeling fine. Richard sighed. You do not need to protect everyone from the truth. Margaret put down her fork. What truth? That the doctors are concerned. Claire's face changed. Mom. My cardiologist wants me to avoid unnecessary stress. That is not new. Richard nodded sympathetically. And yet you insist on carrying the entire company. I do not carry it alone. No, he said, but you refuse to create a clear transition plan. Claire glanced between them. We have had a transition plan for years. Richard looked surprised. Have you? Margaret saw the trap too late. Claire's eyes narrowed. You did not tell him. I have not discussed every company document with Richard. But you discussed the will. Richard looked down, as if embarrassed by private information Claire had exposed. Margaret's pulse quickened. Claire continued. You told me you were leaving him controlling interest. That was before. Before what? Before I objected to the wedding. Richard reached for Margaret's arm. This is not the time. Claire laughed without humor. Of course not. There is never a time to talk about what you are doing. What I am doing? Margaret asked. You married a man you barely knew, changed the estate plan, and pushed me out of every meaningful conversation. Richard lowered his voice. Claire, your mother is recovering from a difficult year. Do not explain my mother to me. I am trying to protect her. From whom? He did not answer. Claire looked at Margaret. Do you even hear how he talks? Margaret wanted to tell her everything. She wanted to say that the old will no longer existed, that Richard was being watched, that every cruel distance between them had been manufactured by a man sitting at their table. But Naomi's warning echoed in her mind. If Richard learned too early that the will had changed, He might abandon the marriage before they had evidence of fraud. He might destroy records. He might retaliate. So Margaret made the choice she would regret most. "Richard is my husband," she said. "You will speak to him with respect in my home." Claire's face went still. The pain in her eyes was worse than anger. "Your home," she repeated. "Claire?" "No, I understand." She stood and picked up her purse. Richard rose halfway. "Please do not leave like this." Claire looked at him. "You already won. Stop pretending you want me to stay." The front door closed less than a minute later. Margaret remained at the table, unable to look toward the hallway. Richard sat down slowly. "That was difficult," he said. Margaret turned to him. There was satisfaction behind his concern. He had wanted the wound, and she had helped him make it. That night she sat alone in the sunroom until after midnight. The house was quiet except for the old clock in the hall. Evelyn entered carrying a blanket and placed it around Margaret's shoulders. "You should sleep," Evelyn said. "I hurt my daughter." "You are trying to protect her." Margaret looked at her. Protection should not feel so much like betrayal. Evelyn sat beside her. "Then tell her." "I cannot yet." "Because the lawyer said so." "Because Richard is more dangerous than I thought." Evelyn's hands tightened. Margaret studied her face. "What happened?" "Nothing." "Evelyn." The older woman looked toward the doorway. "He asked for the medicine cabinet key." "When?" "This morning. He said you wanted him to organize your prescriptions." "I said no such thing." "I did not give it to him." Margaret stood so quickly that the blanket fell. "Has he asked before?" "Twice." "Why did you not tell me?" "You were happy." Margaret almost laughed at the terrible simplicity of it. "No," she said, "I was performing happiness." She took Evelyn's hands. "From now on, you tell me everything, even if it seems small, especially if it seems small." The next morning, Margaret had a second lock installed on the medicine cabinet and told Richard the pharmacy had recommended it. He smiled. 2 days later, the key disappeared. Margaret found it beneath his socks. She did not confront him. Instead, she called Luis Ortega and said, "I think the performance is about to become a crime." Luis wanted Margaret out of the house. Naomi wanted the marriage ended. Claire, if she had known the truth, would have wanted Richard arrested immediately. Margaret listened to all of them and did none of those things. She agreed to precautions. Evelyn would keep Margaret's medication in a locked box inside her own room. A small camera was installed in the hallway outside the medicine cabinet. Luis arranged for a retired nurse named Denise Harper to visit 3 times a week under the excuse of helping Margaret manage fatigue. Naomi updated the trust documents and placed copies in 3 separate locations. But Margaret refused to leave. "Every day I remain," she told Naomi, "he becomes more confident." "Confidence is not evidence." "No, but confidence creates evidence." It arrived sooner than expected. Richard began attending company meetings without invitation. He introduced himself to department heads as Margaret's strategic advisor. He requested access to executive reports and asked the finance director for a list of properties owned without debt. When refused, he laughed and said there had been a misunderstanding. Then he approached a board member privately and suggested Margaret's health was deteriorating. The board member, Samuel Price, had known Margaret for 30 years. He called her immediately. "I thought you should hear it from me," Samuel said. "Richard says you are having periods of confusion." Margaret stood at her office window overlooking the factory floor. "Did he give examples?" "He said you forgot a dinner and misplaced medication." "Anything else?" "He believes the company needs an emergency succession vote." Margaret's reflection in the glass looked calm. Inside, anger moved through her with such force that she had to grip the windowsill. "Thank you, Samuel. What do you want me to do?" "Nothing yet, let him speak. Write down every word." That afternoon, Margaret called a special meeting with Naomi, Lewis, Samuel, and Dr. Bennett. They gathered in a private conference room at the hospital. Dr. Bennett reviewed Margaret's medical records. You are not cognitively impaired. Your heart condition is stable, though stress is not helping. Can Richard obtain power of attorney without my consent? Naomi answered, not while you are competent, but if he convinces a court there is an emergency, he could seek temporary guardianship. He would need medical support or evidence of dangerous behavior. Lewis placed a folder on the table, which means we should expect him to manufacture both. Margaret looked at Dr. Bennett. Has he contacted you? 4 times. I refuse to discuss your care. Could he find another doctor? Anyone can find a doctor willing to express concern after hearing a carefully edited story. Samuel leaned forward. Margaret, we can remove him from the company property. Not yet. Naomi exhaled. You keep saying that. Because he believes he is close. If we push him away, he will change tactics. And if we do not, then we control the stage. Margaret's plan was simple and dangerous. She would announce a temporary medical leave from Ellison Textiles. Richard would believe his pressure had worked. During that leave, she would allow him limited access to carefully prepared financial documents containing false opportunities. Every document would be tracked. Every conversation would be recorded where legally permitted. The board would appear divided while remaining united behind her. Most importantly, Margaret would pretend that Claire had been removed from the succession plan. Samuel objected, that will destroy her. I know. You need to tell her. I cannot risk Richard learning through anyone's reaction. Claire would never betray you. I am not afraid she would betray me. I am afraid she would confront him. Naomi looked at Margaret for a long time. You are asking your daughter to believe you chose him. Margaret lowered her eyes. I already made her believe it. The announcement was released on a Monday morning. Margaret Ellison would take a 3-month leave to focus on her health. Samuel Price would oversee operations. Richard Vale would serve as an unpaid family liaison during the transition. Richard read the statement twice at breakfast. Then he kissed Margaret on the forehead. I am proud of you, he said. For leaving the company. For trusting the people who love you. Margaret smiled into her coffee. Within 48 hours, Richard entered her private office while she was at a medical appointment. The hallway camera captured him unlocking the door with a copied key. He spent 37 minutes photographing documents. One was a decoy summary showing a dormant company account with $6.8 million in liquid assets. 3 days later, a shell corporation was registered in Nevada. Its mailing address belonged to Kendra Shaw's cousin. Lewis traced the filing and brought the records to Margaret. He is preparing somewhere to move the money, he said. He cannot access it. He does not know that. What else? Kendra met with Peter Sloan, Richard's attorney. And about. We could not hear the conversation, but she left with guardianship forms. Margaret felt the room grow smaller. Lewis watched her carefully. This is the moment to stop. No, she said. This is the moment to make him believe he needs to hurry. That evening, Margaret stumbled on the staircase. It was intentional. Denise, the nurse, was positioned in the hall. Evelyn was in the kitchen. Richard had just entered from the patio. Margaret let one hand slip from the railing and sat down hard on the 3rd step. Denise rushed forward. Richard reached her first. Do not move, he said, kneeling beside her. His concern looked convincing. Margaret blinked slowly. Where am I? Richard's eyes changed. Only for a second. But Margaret saw hope. You are home, he said gently. You fell. I did. Denise checked Margaret's pulse. Mrs. Ellison, what day is it? Margaret gave the wrong day. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. She has been doing this more often. Denise looked at him. Doing what? Losing track of things, forgetting where she is. That is not in my notes. She hides it from you. Margaret watched him build the lie while she sat inches away. By the time the ambulance arrived, Richard had told two paramedics that Margaret had suffered weeks of confusion, missed medication, and unsafe behavior. At the hospital, he requested a neurological evaluation and asked whether temporary guardianship might be necessary for her protection. The doctor found nothing wrong. Richard seemed disappointed. Later, in the private hospital room, he sat beside Margaret's bed and stroked her hair. "You frightened me," he whispered. "I am sorry. You cannot be alone anymore. I have Evelyn. Evelyn is not family. She has cared for me longer than you have known me." His hand stopped. "I am trying to help. I know. We should put the legal documents in place before something serious happens." "What documents?" "Power of attorney, medical authority, nothing unusual." Margaret turned her face toward him. "Would that make you feel safer?" Relief softened his expression. "It would protect both of us. Bring me the papers tomorrow." Richard kissed her hand. After he left, Margaret pressed the call button. Denise entered from the hall, holding a small recorder that had captured every word. The next day, Richard brought a stack of documents. He did not bring the limited medical power of attorney he had described. He brought a durable power of attorney granting him authority over nearly every financial account, company interest, trust asset, property transaction, and legal claim in Margaret's name. A second document authorized him to remove officers from Ellison Textiles. A third gave him control over her medical care and residential placement if two physicians declared her impaired. Peter Sloan had prepared them. Richard placed adhesive tabs beside each signature line. "You do not need to read all of this now," he said. Peter used standard language. Margaret looked weakly toward the window. "My glasses are at home. I can explain it." He summarized the documents dishonestly, reducing broad financial powers to permission to speak with doctors and pay household bills. Margaret signed. At least Richard believed she did. The pen contained disappearing ink. Naomi had provided it. The papers were immediately photographed by the camera, hidden in a clock on the wall. Denise witnessed Richard's explanation from the bathroom, with the door slightly open. When Richard left the hospital carrying the documents, he walked faster than usual. Margaret waited 10 minutes before calling Naomi. "He has them." "Did he describe them accurately?" "Not even close." "Then we have attempted fraud and evidence of misrepresentation." "Not enough." Naomi's voice sharpened. "What would be enough for you?" Margaret looked at the closed hospital door. "Enough to make sure he can never do this again." Richard discovered the signatures had vanished the following morning. His reaction was captured by a camera Lewis had installed in Peter Sloan's office with Peter's reluctant cooperation. Peter had begun to understand that his client was not simply an ambitious husband. He was a man using legal documents to exploit a supposedly vulnerable woman, and Peter did not want to lose his license for helping him. Richard slammed the papers onto the desk. "What happened?" Peter stared at the blank signature lines. "She did not sign." "I watched her." "You watched her write something. There are no signatures." Richard paced. "She knows." "Knows what?" "Everything." Peter's face paled. "Then this ends now." "No. I will not prepare another document. You already prepared these. Based on your representation that your wife requested them." "Oh, she did." "Did she understand them?" Richard turned slowly. "Be careful." Peter stood. "I am withdrawing." Richard leaned across the desk. "You owe me." "I owe you nothing. I paid your gambling debt." Peter froze. Richard smiled without humor. "You thought that was generosity." From the adjoining room, Lewis listened through headphones. The meeting had just become much larger than elder exploitation. Richard had been paying Peter's debts in exchange for legal work. The shell corporation, the guardianship papers, and the fraudulent power of attorney were part of a coordinated plan. But Richard still believed the only thing standing between him and Margaret's fortune was time. He returned home that evening carrying white roses. Margaret was in the sunroom. He placed the flowers beside her and sat across from her. "You look better. I feel better." The hospital said there was nothing wrong. "So it seems." He watched her. "Did you sign the papers yesterday?" "I believe so." "You believe." "I was tired." "Do you remember the pen you used?" Margaret looked puzzled, a black one. His jaw tightened. "Why?" "The signatures did not take." "How strange." "Very." They sat in silence. Outside, rain moved across the lawn in thin silver lines. Richard leaned forward. "Margaret, is there something you want to tell me?" She met his eyes. "And yes." His shoulders stiffened. "The roses need trimming." For the first time since their wedding, Richard looked afraid. He did not know the phrase was a warning. He only knew that Margaret had spoken it like a sentence with another meaning. Naomi contacted Claire that night. She did not reveal the entire plan, but she told her enough. "Your mother did not choose Richard over you," Naomi said. "She is trying to protect you." Claire gripped the phone. "From what?" "A man who is attempting to take control of her estate." "Then get her out of that house." "We are trying." "No, you are watching." "Your mother has made decisions I advised against." Claire stood in her dark apartment, looking at a framed photograph of herself and Margaret taken before the arguments began. "Does she know you called me?" "No." "Then tell me where Richard will be tomorrow." Naomi hesitated. "Claire, do not confront him." "I am not asking for advice. I cannot give you information that puts Margaret at risk." Claire's voice broke. "She is already at risk." The following morning, Claire drove to the Ellison house without warning. She found Richard in the garage, placing a small bottle into the pocket of Margaret's car door. He did not hear her approach. "What is that?" Claire asked. Richard turned. For 1 second, neither moved. Then Richard smiled. "Your mother's heart medication." Claire looked at the bottle. "Why is it in the car?" "In case she needs it." "She does not keep medication there." "She does now." Claire reached for the bottle. Richard caught her wrist. His grip was immediate and hard. "Let go of me." "You should not have come here." "Let go." He pulled her closer, the smile vanished. "You have caused enough trouble." Claire's fear became anger. She drove her knee into his leg and twisted free. The bottle fell, rolled beneath the car, and struck the far wall. Richard lunged for it. Claire reached it first. The label was not Margaret's medication. It was a concentrated sedative prescribed to Kendra Shaw. Claire stared at him. "What were you planning?" Richard's face became calm again. "You do not understand." "I understand exactly." She lifted her phone. Richard knocked it from her hand. It shattered against the concrete. Then a voice came from the garage entrance. "I would step away from my daughter." Margaret stood beside Evelyn, one hand resting on her cane. Behind them were Louis Ortega and 2 uniformed police officers. Richard looked at the bottle in Claire's hand. Then he looked at Margaret. The performance was over. The police did not arrest Richard that morning. The bottle was suspicious, but suspicion was not proof. Richard claimed he had found it beneath the passenger seat after Kendra used the car to move wedding supplies months earlier. He said he had placed it in the door pocket so he could return it. Kendra, contacted by phone, confirmed that she had once lost a prescription bottle at the Ellison house. Claire accused him of lying. Richard accused Claire of breaking into the garage, attacking him, and inventing a story because she hated the marriage. The officers collected the bottle and took statements. Lewis gave them copies of the power of attorney recordings and the Shell Corporation records, but the investigation would take time. Richard stood in the driveway while the police cars left. Then he turned to Margaret. "You set me up." Margaret's face was pale, but her voice remained steady. "You placed a sedative in my car." "You cannot prove that." "I do not need to prove it to know. I will never sleep beneath the same roof as you again." He looked at Claire. This is what she wanted. Claire stepped forward, but Margaret raised a hand. "No," Margaret said. "Do not give him another place to hide." Richard's eyes returned to his wife. "What does that mean?" "It means you have survived by making women fight each other, while you stand between them, collecting what falls from their hands." His expression hardened. Margaret continued. "Helen and her sister, Kendra and every woman you told her to fear, Claire and me, you call the damage proof that you are needed." At the sound of his former wife's name, Richard went still. Margaret saw it. "So you did look into me," he said. "I looked after I listened." "Listened to what?" "The conversation you had with Kendra before our wedding." The color left his face. Claire stared at her mother. Evelyn whispered Margaret's name. Richard recovered quickly. "You misunderstood. You discussed my heart, my daughter, my will, and how long you expected to wait before you stopped hiding your affair." Kendra's name seemed to remain in the air between them. Richard gave a small laugh. "And you married me anyway." "And yes." For the first time, genuine disbelief crossed his face. "Why?" Margaret looked at the man who had entered her loneliness, studied its shape, and decided it was an unlocked door. "Because I wanted to see whether knowing the truth would make you less convincing." "And it made you ordinary." His mouth tightened. "You think this ends with a dramatic speech? I am your husband, this is my home." "No, it is mine." Marital property laws may disagree. The house is held in a separate trust created before our marriage. The prenuptial agreement you signed confirms it. Richard looked toward the front door. Naomi stepped out onto the porch holding a folder. "You have 1 hour to collect personal belongings," she said. "A petition for a protective order has been filed. Any attempt to access Mrs. Ellison's financial accounts, offices, vehicles, or medical information will be documented and reported." Richard looked from Naomi to Lewis, then to the police car still visible at the end of the drive. He smiled at Margaret. "Not kindly. You should be very careful with your heart." Claire moved toward him, but Margaret caught her hand. Richard walked inside to pack. When he was gone, Margaret released a breath that seemed to have been held since the night before her wedding. Claire turned to her. "You knew." Margaret nodded. "All this time." "And yes." "And you let me believe," Claire's voice failed. "I know. You let me believe you chose him over me. I thought distance would protect you." Claire stepped back. "Protect me?" He put his hands on me in your garage. "I never imagined." "That is the problem. You imagined you could control him." Margaret looked down. Claire wiped tears from her face with an angry motion. "You trusted an investigator. You trusted Naomi. You trusted the board. You trusted Evelyn. But you did not trust me." "I trusted your love. I did not trust what your love would make you do." "You mean confront him?" "And yes." "Like I did today." "And yes." Claire shook her head. "You do not get to call that protection." Margaret's eyes filled. "No," she said, "I do not." The simple agreement broke something open between them. Claire had prepared herself for defense, authority, and explanation. She had expected Margaret to justify every choice as necessary. Instead, her mother stood in the driveway looking suddenly older than 63, with one hand trembling against her cane. "I was ashamed," Margaret said. "Not of him, of myself. I believed that if I solved the danger before telling you, I could return to you without admitting how completely he fooled me." Claire's anger softened but did not disappear. "You were lonely." "I was proud." You were human. Margaret looked at her daughter. It had been years since anyone had offered her that permission. Claire opened her arms. Margaret stepped into them. She cried against her daughter's shoulder while workers carried Richard's suitcases from the house. She cried for Thomas, for the empty years after his death, for the wedding that had been a lie, and for the daughter she had nearly sacrificed to avoid appearing foolish. Richard left at noon. He took his clothes, 2 watches, a laptop, and a framed wedding photograph that did not belong to him. He also took a copy of Margaret's old will from a drawer in the library. The document left nearly 70% of her estate to her surviving spouse. He did not know it had been revoked. For the next 6 weeks, Richard fought from every direction. He challenged the protective order. He accused Claire and Naomi of manipulating Margaret. He filed a petition requesting an independent competency evaluation. He sent letters to board members claiming Margaret had become unstable and vindictive. Through Peter Sloane, he warned that any attempt to remove him from the estate would violate agreements made during the marriage. Then Peter withdrew as his attorney. 3 days later, the Shell Corporation vanished from state records. Lewis discovered that Kendra had left town. Richard's confidence began to crack. He called Margaret from unlisted numbers. She did not answer. He sent flowers. She returned them. He wrote a 5-page letter describing himself as a wounded husband and Margaret as a frightened woman controlled by her daughter. Margaret read it once. Then she placed it in the evidence file. The divorce petition was filed on a Friday. On Saturday morning, Margaret woke with crushing pain in her chest. Denise called an ambulance. Claire rode with her to the hospital. Tests showed that Margaret's heart condition had worsened significantly. Years of damage, stress, and an undetected arterial problem had left her with fewer options than anyone expected. Dr. Bennett spoke gently. "We can attempt surgery, but the risk is high." "And without it?" Margaret asked. "Months, perhaps less if there is another major event." Claire gripped her mother's hand. Margaret looked at the ceiling for a long time. All year, she had behaved as though survival were a problem she could solve with preparation. Now her body had presented a contract with terms she could not renegotiate. "Can I go home?" she asked. "With full-time support." "I want to go home." The divorce could not be completed quickly. Richard's attorneys delayed hearings and disputed disclosures. Naomi assured Margaret the will was secure, the trust was protected, and the pending divorce strengthened the estate's position. But Richard remained her legal husband. When he learned about her prognosis, he stopped fighting the competency evaluation. He began waiting. Margaret knew this because Lewis watched him visit the county records office, request copies of probate procedures, and meet with a financial advisor who specialized in inherited assets. "He believes the old will is still valid," Naomi said. They were sitting in Margaret's bedroom while afternoon sunlight moved across the quilt. "Good," Margaret replied. "Good. If he knew the truth, he would spend my final days trying to create a different one." Naomi closed the file. "There is something else. Peter Sloane is cooperating with investigators. He admits Richard paid his debts and pressured him to prepare misleading documents." "Will he testify?" "And yes. And Kendra." "Lewis found her in Colorado. She is frightened. Richard has been sending threatening messages." Margaret turned toward the window. "Bring her home." Naomi frowned. "Why?" "Because she knows what he planned. She also helped him. So did I, in a different way. I gave him access because I wanted proof." "That is not the same." "No, but blame is a poor reason to refuse useful truth." Kendra returned 2 weeks later. She came to the Ellison house after dark, wearing no makeup and carrying a suitcase with a broken wheel. Evelyn almost refused to let her inside. Margaret asked to see her alone. Kendra entered the sunroom but remained near the door. "You look well," she said. Margaret smiled faintly. "We are beyond polite lies." Kendra lowered her eyes. "Did Richard ask you to sedate me?" Margaret asked. Kendra's head lifted. I never agreed to hurt you. That was not my question. He said he needed you confused, just once. He wanted a doctor to see it. And the bottle. He took it from my apartment. Why did you tell the police you lost it here? Kendra began to cry. He said he would tell them I planned everything. He has emails, messages. I helped with the shell company. Why? Because he promised we would be together. Margaret studied her. Did you love him? Kendra laughed bitterly. I loved who I thought I would become beside him. That is not the same thing. I know. Margaret reached toward the recorder on the table. If you tell the truth now, it will not erase what you did. I know. It may not keep you out of prison. I know. Then why are you here? Kendra looked at her through tears. Because when he learned you were dying, he smiled. Margaret pressed the record button. Kendra spoke for 2 hours. She described the conversation before the wedding, the plan to isolate Claire, the guardianship papers, the Shell Corporation, the copied keys, and Richard's attempts to obtain Margaret's medication. She admitted he had researched drug interactions and asked whether a sedative could make heart symptoms look like confusion. Most importantly, she described a message Richard sent after Margaret left the hospital. If the old woman's heart does what it is supposed to do, none of this matters. Kendra had saved it. When she finished, Margaret looked exhausted but peaceful. Thank you, she said. Kendra wiped her face. How can you thank me? For arriving before it was too late to tell the truth. Kendra stood to leave. At the door, Margaret spoke again. He will say you are weak. Kendra turned. Do not confuse being late with being weak, Margaret said, but do not be late again. After Kendra left, Claire entered and sat beside her mother. Was it worth it? She asked. Margaret knew she meant the marriage, the trap, the months of danger. No, Margaret said, nothing that cost me time with you could be worth it. Claire rested her head against her mother's shoulder. For the next several weeks, they stopped speaking about Richard unless the investigators needed something. They watched old movies. They sorted family photographs. Margaret told Claire stories about Thomas that she had never shared. Evelyn cooked meals no doctor would have approved, and Ruth came from Arizona with 3 suitcases and a determination to make everyone laugh. The house became Margaret's again. Not because Richard's belongings were gone. Because fear was no longer deciding what happened in each room. 3 days before Margaret died, Richard asked to see her. Naomi advised against it. Claire refused immediately. Louis said any meeting would need to be recorded and supervised. Margaret listened from her chair beside the sunroom windows. Let him come, she said. Claire stared at her. Why? Because he believes he is running out of time. That is exactly why he should stay away. Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. I am not inviting him back into my life. I am giving him one final opportunity to reveal what he values. Richard arrived at 4 in the afternoon. He had lost weight. The expensive suit hung loosely at his shoulders, and the confidence that once filled every room had become restless energy. He carried no flowers. Perhaps he had finally understood that Margaret would not mistake decoration for remorse. Louis watched from the library through a hidden camera. Naomi remained in the next room. Claire stood beside the sunroom door until Margaret asked her to leave. You look tired, Richard said when they were alone. So do you. He sat across from her. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Richard sighed. This has gone too far. Margaret almost smiled. You put a sedative in my car. You have no proofs. You asked to see a dying woman so you could repeat that. His eyes moved toward the table, the desk, the shelves. He was searching for documents even while pretending to search for words. I came because we were happy once. No, you were hopeful once. About us. About the estate. He leaned forward. Your daughter has poisoned you against me. Claire did not know the truth until after I did. Richard studied her face. When did you find out? Before the wedding. He gave a short, disbelieving laugh. You keep saying that. Because you keep hoping it is not true. Then why marry me? I thought I needed proof. For whom? For Claire, for the company, for the law, perhaps for myself. And now I understand that knowing the truth and refusing to leave is not courage. Sometimes it is pride wearing armor. Richard looked irritated by the answer. You are trying to make this philosophical. I am trying to make it honest. He stood and walked toward the windows. The divorce is not final. I know. I am still your husband. Legally. That word matters. To you, it is the only word that matters. Richard turned. If you die before the divorce, the law recognizes me as your spouse. Margaret said nothing. He continued, choosing each word carefully. Whatever anger exists between us, I will make sure your wishes are respected. My wishes. For the company, the foundation, Claire. He moved closer. But there could be conflict. Your daughter may challenge the estate. The board may take advantage of uncertainty. If you sign a simple statement confirming the existing plan, I can protect what you wanted. From inside his jacket, he removed a folded document. Even then, even after the police, the recordings, the investigation, and the dying woman before him, Richard had come for a signature. Margaret looked at the paper but did not reach for it. What existing plan? The will you described before we married. The one leaving most of the estate to you. His expression softened. To your spouse, you made that decision freely. Before I understood who my spouse was. His hand tightened around the document. Did you change it? Margaret let the silence stretch. Richard's eyes became cold. If Claire pressured you. She did not. Naomi then. No. Did you change it? Margaret looked past him at the garden Thomas had planted decades earlier. The last roses of the season lined beneath the afternoon sun. I learned something from you, she said. What? People reveal themselves when they believe an answer will make them rich. Richard waited. Margaret smiled. So I think I will let you wait for the answer. His face changed completely. The wounded husband vanished. The charming companion vanished. What remained was a desperate man who had spent years believing patience entitled him to a reward. You think Claire will save you? He said. When you are gone, she will spend years fighting me. I will challenge every document. I will drag your name through court. I will tell the world you were confused, unstable, and controlled. Margaret's voice remained soft. Thank you. For what? For saying it clearly. Richard looked around the room. Naomi entered from the library holding the recorder. Claire appeared behind her. Richard stared at them, then at Margaret. You did this again. No, Margaret said, you did. He left the house without the statement he had brought. It was the last time Margaret saw him. 2 nights later, rain began after midnight. Claire was asleep on the sofa beside Margaret's bed. Evelyn sat in the hallway reading beneath a small lamp. Margaret woke and asked for the window to be opened. Claire moved beside her. Are you in pain? No. Should I call Denise? Not yet. The room filled with the smell of rain and wet earth. Margaret looked toward the dark garden. Your father loved nights like this, she whispered. Claire took her hand. I wished he were here. He is in every good thing we kept. Margaret's breathing became slower. Claire, do not let what happened make you suspicious of love. Claire's eyes filled. How can it not? Be suspicious of urgency. Be suspicious of isolation. Be suspicious of anyone who needs you smaller so they can feel necessary. But do not be suspicious of kindness simply because someone once copied it badly. Claire bent over her mother's hand. I am sorry we lost so much time. Margaret touched her hair. We found the truth before the end, Many people do not. Evelyn entered quietly and stood on the other side of the bed. Margaret looked at both women. Then she closed her eyes. Her final breath came gently, almost hidden beneath the rain. The investigators found no poison, no sedative, and no evidence that Richard had caused her death. Margaret Ellison died from the heart condition she had lived with for years. Richard told reporters he had been denied the chance to say goodbye. He filed a petition the morning of the funeral seeking emergency authority over the estate. Attached to it was a copy of the revoked will he had taken from Margaret's library. In a sworn statement, he claimed he had no reason to believe a later will existed. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, he sat in Naomi Patel's conference room and watched Margaret tell him exactly when she had changed it. On the screen, Margaret's recorded message continued. The document Richard possesses was revoked before our wedding. He removed it from my home without permission. Its use in any legal proceeding should be treated as evidence of his intent, not mine. Richard turned toward Peter Sloane. Did you know about this? Peter looked down. No. Naomi opened the cream-colored folder. Margaret's final will and trust were executed with independent witnesses and confirmed during multiple medical competency evaluations. The company's shares are held in an irrevocable trust. Claire Ellison receives voting control. $30 million will be added to the employee pension fund. The Ellison Foundation receives the majority of the remaining estate. Evelyn Carter receives the right to live in Margaret's home for the rest of her life, with all expenses paid by the trust. Evelyn began to cry. Ruth reached for her hand. Richard's voice was barely controlled, and the spouse. Naomi turned one page. Under Article 9, Richard Vail would have received the lake cottage and a $2 million trust only if the marriage lasted 10 years and no finding of fraud, coercion, exploitation, abuse, neglect, or criminal conduct occurred. Our marriage did not last 10 years because she died. Correct. So the condition is impossible. I will challenge it. Naomi looked at him. The clause further states that if Margaret died before the 10th anniversary, the gift could still be approved by the trustees if her death was natural, and the marriage had been conducted in good faith. Richard leaned back slightly. Then I qualify. No. Naomi placed copies of the recordings, financial transfers, guardianship papers, and Kendra's statement on the table. The trustees unanimously determined that you do not. His face reddened. You cannot leave a husband with nothing. Margaret left you something. Naomi removed a small envelope. Richard stared at it. On the front, in Margaret's handwriting, were the words, "For the man who believed everything had a price." Naomi passed it to him. Inside was a single brass key and a note. Richard read aloud before realizing he should not. This key opens the storage room at the lake cottage. Inside is every gift you gave me during our marriage. The watch, the necklace, the letters written by someone else, and the framed photograph you took from my home have been returned there. They are the only things in my life that were truly yours. A second line was written beneath it. You may keep the key. It is the closest you will ever come to owning what you married me to obtain. Ruth let out a breath that sounded almost like laughter. Richard tore the note in half. You think this is finished? He shouted. I will contest everything. I will expose all of you. The conference room door opened. Luis Ortega entered with 2 detectives. Richard looked at Peter. Peter would not meet his eyes. One detective stepped forward. Richard Vail, you are under arrest on charges including attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery-related offenses, witness intimidation, and filing a materially false sworn statement. Richard stood so quickly that his chair struck the wall. This is a family dispute. The detective placed one hand near the cuffs on his belt. Turn around. Richard looked at Claire. Your mother used you. Claire rose from her chair. No, she said, she finally trusted me. As the detectives led him away, Richard twisted toward the screen. Margaret's image was still visible behind the dark reflection of the room. For the first time, he looked at her without seeing money. He looked at her and saw defeat. Peter Sloan later pleaded guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for his cooperation. Kendra received probation and was ordered to testify in the financial exploitation case. Richard's former wife, Helen, submitted evidence of forged transfers from their marriage, helping prosecutors establish a pattern. Richard was convicted on multiple counts. The sentence did not restore Margaret's final year. It did not erase Claire's guilt, Evelyn's fear, or the humiliation Kendra would carry. Justice rarely repairs the past as neatly as people hope. But it stopped Richard from repeating it. 1 year after Margaret's death, Claire stood outside the original Ellison warehouse before a crowd of employees and families. The old building had been renovated into the Margaret Ellison Center for Financial Safety, offering free legal assistance to older adults facing fraud, coercion, and exploitation. A bronze plaque near the entrance carried no list of Margaret's business achievements. Claire had chosen a sentence from her mother's final letter. Loneliness is not consent, kindness is not weakness, and love never asks you to surrender the people who protect you. Evelyn cut the ribbon. Ruth cried before the ceremony began and denied it afterward. Former employees walked through the new offices telling stories about Margaret. Some remembered her as demanding. Others remembered the checks she sent quietly when illness kept a worker home. One retired supervisor said Margaret could identify a weak contract from across a room, but had needed time to recognize a weak man standing beside her. Claire smiled. Her mother would have appreciated the honesty. That evening, after everyone left, Claire drove to the lake cottage. The property had been sold, and the proceeds had funded the center. The storage room was empty except for a dusty square on the floor where a box had once rested. Richard had never collected the gifts. Perhaps he understood that they were worthless. Perhaps he could not bear to use the key. Claire walked to the edge of the lake as the sun lowered behind the trees. She carried Margaret's last letter in her coat pocket. She had read it so many times that the folds had begun to soften. The final paragraph was not about Richard. It was about the life after him. Do not build a monument to what he tried to take, Margaret had written. Build something from what remains. Money can be stolen, houses can be entered, signatures can be forged, and trust can be abused. But a person who returns to the truth is not ruined. She is returned to herself. Claire watched the water turn gold. For months, she had thought the changed will was her mother's greatest victory. It was not. The will protected the fortune. The truth protected everyone else. And in the end, Richard received exactly what he had brought into Margaret's life: an empty promise, a useless key, and nothing that love had built. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments. At what moment did Richard reveal his true character? And remember, the most dangerous kind of greed often arrives dressed as devotion.